Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Blake Ryder, and I am the Director of Hospitality Research here at Lighthouse. Joining me is my man, Daniel Foreman. Daniel, who are you and why are you here?
Hey, everybody. My name is Daniel Foreman. I'm a commercial strategist here at Lighthouse, and I have a background in revenue management. So, super excited to talk about our topic today, which is playoff wins.
Yeah, I'm excited too. This one was a blast to really research, and we hope you guys really enjoy this one. So yeah, like Daniel said, we're going to try to quantify how much a playoff win, those high value sports wins, are worth to hoteliers when they create additional playoff games and the results that happen. So we're going to start off here. Okay, now the key here is just because we say a certain win resulted in X percent to pricing power for a hotel, that doesn't necessarily mean that is what it's going to happen in the future, because there's a lot of other factors at play that we are considering, and we're going to try to dive in and really peel back the layers and understand what caused that. So, for example, a team's fan base. Some teams are known to have fan bases that travel really well, and other teams are not necessarily known to travel well. So the team's fan base is going to have a big consideration. The distance to travel is going to have a big consideration. And what I mean there is not only the traveling from the actual home city to the host city of the game, but also the amount of time it takes to get from a city to the stadium. So the amount of time fans would have to travel to get to a stadium. Star power. Are those athletes on those teams going to really drum up demand to your hotel, to your city, and other stars potentially that might be attending the games? We'll get to that a little bit later. The round of the playoffs. So are we talking first round of the playoffs? Are we talking wild card weekend of football? Or are we talking, game seven, the end of a series, those types of games? The time gap between games. So is it baseball where, because of one win, now we have an additional game and that additional game is 1 or 2 days later? Or is it like football where a win will then result in an additional game a week later, allowing you time to build up pricing and generate demand? Beyond that, we also have the consideration of what the typical level of demand is for that time of year. Is it otherwise a high demand time or a low demand time? Because that is going to influence the ability to drive pricing. And last but not least, we have the results of other games in the series, because there may be a perception that there's a blowout and maybe people don't want to necessarily make a trip if that's the case. So beyond that, we have other factors that we'll also get into. Daniel, what do you think of these as a former revenue manager? Any of these really jump out or things you want to add?
No, that was great. I mean, yeah, these are all factors that we're looking at as revenue managers. And as we walk through, we're going to start with some NFL examples, then we'll move to MLB examples, and then finally some Champions League examples. But yeah, these are all things that you have to factor in and look at if you're a revenue manager. And we'll kind of I'll call out as we go through each of these examples, like which of these factors we think is most at play.
Yes. So before we get into the numbers, let's quickly talk about this. Marge Schott, if you're not familiar with who she is, she was the owner of the Cincinnati Reds when they ultimately won the 1990 World Series. Now, I'm not going to get into too much detail about her because she was generally a less than savory individual. Southside Sox, this was a quote from their website. Marge Schott was the majority owner of the Reds until baseball rightfully forced her out for reasons being extremely racist and personally awful. So, but all that said, as you see the quote here on the screen, it just shows how even back in the 90s, owners were very aware of how playoff games could really drive revenue and having those incremental wins, the incremental games. ESPN said she was so angry that the Reds won the World Series in 4 games, and owners don't start making most of their money until the fifth, that she refused to buy food or drinks for the celebration party. So, that's how it is. So owners, hoteliers, they want those games to happen. Okay. So let's get into this. We'll start with the National Football League, the NFL, and we will specifically look at the most recent playoff season from the 2023-2024 season. And we are going to look at the Detroit Lions, specifically the January 21st home game against the Buccaneers. Now, I'm going to walk you through this timeline. A month before that game against the Buccaneers, the one January 21 home game, pricing for that game was at $113. The day before the wild card playoff game, pricing was still $113. And then on January 14th, this is a critical day. Pricing is still $113. However, the Lions defeat the Rams and the Packers defeat the Cowboys. Now, the Packers defeating the Cowboys is critical because the Lions were the number 3 seed, Cowboys were the number 2 seed. So because the Packers won and beat the Cowboys, now the Lions were one of the remaining 2 highest seed teams. And the higher seed teams get to host the games. So because the Packers beat the Cowboys, we knew the Lions would host a playoff game regardless of what happened in the other game, which was the Bucs game. So the very next day after the Lions win, pricing spikes up to 130, and then game day against the Bucs, it was 132. Daniel, can you break this down for us? What are you seeing here?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, I think, a couple of factors going on here, but one of the biggest ones I think is happening is it relates back to what you said at the start of the call, the results of other games, right? So my Dallas Cowboys were beat by the Packers, which hurt, and that really changed things for the Lions. So they basically were, gifted a home playoff game. So I think what's really important there is if you're a revenue manager, even if you're not a sports person, it's still really, really important to kind of keep up with who's winning, who's losing, knowing the seeds of the different teams as they go on, go into the playoffs. So you know who's going to be hosting a home game versus who's not, because that's exactly what happened here, right? And also, too, there were kind of some other interesting, I kind of put like X factors down with this that had to do with the opponent that the Detroit Lions ultimately got at home, which was the Buccaneers.
Yep. And beyond that, we were talking about the signal to noise ratio because if you think about the the timing with which it happened, it was literally the next day. So looking
Mhm.
at something like this, we really have high confidence that this was the reason. Because if you think about it, this is the lowest time of pricing really per year. This is Detroit, January. People aren't necessarily going to, or there's not necessarily high demand to go to Detroit at this time of year. So when you have this type of signal resulting in this immediate next day behavior in pricing, we really have a strong uh, reason to believe that the correlation and the triggering event was that win.
Mhm.
Yep. And lastly, it's also worth pointing out that the Bucks, who they ended up facing on January 21st, they started the season 4-7, and they ended up winning 5 of their next 6 games to win their division and finish 9-8. So there was a little bit of people not necessarily taking them seriously because they were viewed as kind of the underdogs, and I think that created a storyline where there was the chance for an upset, so maybe people wanted to see it, a little Cinderella story. But B, I think it also probably created an environment in Michigan where people might have traveled a little bit, been more willing to travel because of the perception that they were facing a weak opponent and they might go to see a playoff win. Moving on, let's go to the Baltimore Ravens. Okay. They were the number 1 seed in the 2023-2024, same year, playoffs. Now, we're going to walk through this timeline. Now, on December 31st, 2023, they win week 17 and they clinch the number 1 seed. And that means that they are going to be the home team throughout the playoffs. As long as they keep winning, they will keep hosting the games up to the Super Bowl, which is at a neutral field. Okay. So 1 week before the divisional championship game on the 13th, pricing for that divisional championship game was $130. Now, on the 15th, the opponent was established for the January 20th divisional game, and immediately we see pricing go up to 140. Then 2 days later, 148 and 155. So Daniel, what do you think here? Why, if we knew that pricing, if we knew that Baltimore was going to host a home game on the 31st, why did it take so long for pricing to actually go up?
Yeah, this is almost it looks like with that pricing evolution chart, it kind of looks like the opposite of what you would expect, right? Because everybody knows that the Ravens are going to host this home game. But what's interesting is I put down as the main factors here are the time of year and then the time in between games. Because a lot like the Detroit example that we looked at, think about what time of year this game is happening, right? This is the dead of winter. in Baltimore. So, if you think about that, like it's very unlikely that hotels are going to want to price really, really high early in the booking curve because even though they know that they have a game, they don't want to alienate or scare off anybody else who might be booking that weekend. So that's why you didn't really see the pricing really skyrocket until that opponent was determined,
Hmm.
which of course was the Texans. And also too, you kind of have to think about strength of the opponent as well, right? Most people knew, okay, we're either going to get the Browns or the Texans, and neither of those teams is necessarily like a really huge traveling team necessarily.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So when you were a revenue manager, Daniel, so you were forced to really keep up with teams that you might not have even been a fan of or follow sports leagues that didn't
Yeah.
necessarily interest you because of these factors that allowed you to be better at your job and really drive revenue at the right time.
Yeah. And in this case, like I would probably even, price based on opponent, right? So if and we'll see this in the next slide when we look at our, the Ravens versus their next opponent, but you're really looking at, strength of schedule, the strength of the other team, all of those factors kind of go into how much you feel like you can push the pricing for any of these given playoff games.
So what you're really saying is that you have to be aware of the other factors, like maybe a star tight end on a team might be dating a global pop sensation named Taylor Swift. Is that
Yeah.
is that what we're talking about here? So the very same year. So just for context, in case you're not up on the dating life of NFL superstars, Travis Kelsey, the tight end of the Chiefs, started dating, and to my understanding, are still dating Taylor Swift. Okay, so this was kind of a phenomenon in football because people would tune in. My own wife, who's not a football fan, would watch games with me because she wanted to see the shots when Travis Kelsey would make a catch, and then they would go to Taylor Swift in a box clapping for her boyfriend. Okay, so let's walk through this game. This is again the same year, and we're going to look at this marquee matchup against the Chiefs on January 28th. So the day before the divisional playoff game that ultimately resulted in the Ravens, the Ravens going on this run. Pricing was $132 for the January 28th playoff game. Then on the 20th, Ravens defeat the Texans, the game we just talked about. Pricing goes up by $2. Okay, almost nothing. The next day, on the 21st, Chiefs defeat the Bills. Pricing goes up $7. And now the day after the Chiefs win. So now the marquee matchup is locked in. Travis Kelsey, Pat Mahomes, and Taylor Swift. All of a sudden, we see pricing go up by $16, more than 10%, and pricing keeps going up to $194, 45% from the time before that kind of run up to $194. So, Daniel, looking at this, what factors really drove this? What could revenue managers glean from this and take away so they can actually put these types of pricing practices into effect for their own properties?
Yeah, I have this marked down as, I mean, this is for sure strength of the opponent with the Chiefs. I mean, everybody knows that the Chiefs are, they're a dynasty at this point. That fan base travels really, really well.
Hmm.
And keep in mind, this is a whole nother round deeper into the playoffs, right? So you've got this really, really strong team coming to town. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the star power factor. So we have, Lamar and Travis Kelsey and Patrick Mahomes and Taylor Swift is in the stand. So yeah, this is why I think we saw that bigger jump in pricing, that significantly bigger jump in pricing for this game over the previous game that we saw. This is, kind of like almost like a best case scenario, I would say, for the Baltimore market,
Hmm.
uh, because the Bills still would have been great, and there still would have been some of that star power effect. But I think it was just really, really amplified with everything going on around the Chiefs
Yeah.
around this time of year.
Yeah, and also that distance to travel factor, Kansas City to Baltimore, not a huge flight. And it's also, I think, worth pointing out if you look at this chart and just compare it to the previous chart over here as well as this one, we see here, just for example, almost all that pricing power was gained in a day. It was steep. Same over here. But with this Chiefs game, we see price just kept going up and up and up as
Mhm.
hoteliers felt more confident that they can keep building price. And I think having that knowledge that of this Taylor Swift factor and how you can just keep building it because of those external factors, I think that really definitely had a significant impact in this situation. So it really just goes to show, revenue managers need to be very attuned to all the factors that are happening with their local teams and their local teams' opponents, because this was a huge pricing opportunity to really keep building price. Next and final football game we'll look at is the San Francisco 49ers. And this was the home game that they faced against the Lions on January 28th. Now, this is an interesting one because the pricing curve, Daniel, is the exact opposite, right, of what we were looking at. Previously, we
Yep.
saw the build. Here, a month before the game, $193, and it just went down to 173 on game day. We have a little pop on January 22nd. That's that little incline we see towards the very end of the curve. And that was the day after the home game was locked in. So a little bit of gain, but then ultimately came down. So on the surface, San Francisco as a market has been performing not super strongly recently. So I do think the external factors of San Francisco as a market probably had something to do here. But there's another factor at play here, Daniel. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so, our astute watchers may kind of already have an idea of what's going on here, and feel free to put it in the chat too if you kind of know what's going on, because we did kind of throw this in here as a little bit of a red herring. But the big factor that's going on here is the proximity to the stadium. So that's a really, really big thing that revenue managers are always thinking about, right? Is on game day when there's crazy traffic, how far are we really from the stadium? So in this case, the San Francisco market where we pulled that data, on game day, it takes you at least an hour to get if you were to start in San Francisco and drive down to San
At
Jose.
least, right? Yeah.
Yeah, at least. So really what we did was we also pulled the San Jose data to kind of show this proximity effect. So really it's the San Jose market that is really seeing the big uptick for the game. So this is just another one of those factors that you really have to be thinking about is, how close am I to the venue? Because even though they're called the San Francisco 49ers, San Francisco proper does not see the amount of rate increase that you would expect.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, goes to show you got to really be know where people want to stay when they come to the games because they're probably traveling just for a day or two. So being close is key. Moving on, let's look at baseball. Baseball is interesting because it's a different structure. We have different best of sevens, not just one-off games. And we're going to start off looking at the price evolution specifically for Game 6 of the National League Championship Series, the NLCS, for the Phillies against the Arizona Diamondbacks. Now, I view this price curve as a curve that really mirrors the emotions of the fan base. And this is really why I think for hoteliers watching this, for revenue managers, for owners, to understand the mindset of your fan base. Because if you let's dive into this and look at this timeline that we created. Okay, so the Phillies win the NLDS, the divisional series, and advance to the NLCS. Right when that happens, prices start to go up. That's right in the beginning of that curve. Okay, Phillies then win Game 1 of the NLCS, and we see this huge spike. There's excitement. There's people are again excited and willing to travel more, spend more, yada yada yada. Now, Game 2 is a bit of a turning point. Okay, that's the middle point of this curve, October 17th. Now, they win 10-0. So now it is a 2-0 lead in the series and a 10-0 win. So now all of a sudden we see pricing coming down a little bit. The thinking here is that when your team wins 10-0, hoteliers maybe have the sentiment that there may not even be a Game 6. And to go back to your earlier point, Daniel, you don't want to isolate the base demand, right? You want to keep that.
Exactly. Yep. So you don't want to scare away anybody who might be looking for a hotel room on that night of Game 6 in the event that Game 6 doesn't even happen. Yep.
Yeah. So now the Diamondbacks actually win Game 3. So now it's 2-1 in the series, but pricing power is still not there because still there's concern about there not being a Game 6. So we don't want to isolate that base demand. But the key factor here is that orange shaded date, October 20th. The Diamondbacks win, and now it's 2-2. So now it's guaranteed there's going to be a Game 6 because it's a best of 7 series. You need to win 4 games. So right off the bat, once that happens, we now see that pricing power back for the hoteliers, and they can now drive it, right? So, Daniel, when you were practicing, you were following the sports meticulously because once you knew this, that now you knew you could price again, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have to, especially with these game or these 7 game series or 5 game series, it's important to know like what the setup is going to be because the momentum can really shift, right? And we're going to see that actually in the next slide. It's this exact same thing, really, really dialed up, where we're going to look at Game 6 and Game 7 of the World Series, and of course,
Ah,
Game 6 and Game 7 didn't happen. So yeah, keeping up
yeah,
with the structure of the playoffs, the momentum of the playoffs is super, super key.
I almost don't want to go to the next slide because I'm a Yankee fan, and this slide pains me a little bit there because there wasn't a Game 6 or a Game 7. This is the World Series that just happened. Okay, so this is the Dodgers against the Yankees, my Yankees, and so we're looking at two different price curves: Game 6 and Game 7. Game 7 is the orange line, Game 6 is the blue line, and just one thing just of note: Game 7's pricing curve was across the board higher than Game 6. Makes sense. If it makes to Game 7, that's where you make your money, or one of the big money making opportunities. But what we see here, we see prices for these games are steady through the playoffs. There's no, again, we now established what you don't want to isolate your base demand. That's a key strategy we're gleaning from this. But the moment that they win the NLCS, kind of right before the pricing builds, we see pricing all of a sudden start, but before that, steady. So let's track this, okay? So they advanced to the World Series on the 20th. Now, Game 1 happens somewhere between the 20th and the 26th, and then the 26th happens, and the Dodgers take a 2-0 lead, and then Game 3 happens on the 28th, and they take a 3-0 lead. Now, right then and there, pricing power is gone for Los Angeles because Game 6 and 7 would be in Los Angeles. They have a 3-0 lead. Game 6 and 7 are probably not going to happen. And spoiler alert, they didn't happen. So the Yankees did win Game 4, but then we see on the 30th, Dodgers win. So right up then, just prices tank. So we're trying to quantify how much a playoff win is worth. This was worth a lot for hotels in it was, well, I should say the playoff win or the loss for the Yankees cost hoteliers in Los Angeles quite a bit if you see how much they actually could not drive pricing. So this kind of goes back to that emotional story we're talking about, is that if you're a hotelier in Los Angeles and you love the Dodgers, you want them to win, but you're like, maybe they could have lost Game 5, so we could have kept the prices high for Game 6. Okay, let's move on to our last sport, Champions League football. I'm sorry, Champions League football. Okay, so we're going to just really quickly, we'll go through the format in case you're not familiar. So Champions League, there's a group stage, bunch of teams, they play each other in a bunch of different formats, and then 16 teams advance. We're going to focus on this, a round of 16. So during the round of 16, two teams get paired together. They play each other twice, 2 games, one in each team's home stadium, and the team that advances is the team that has the higher aggregate score between the 2 games. So it's the summation of the scores for both games. Winner advances. Okay. So what we set out to prove here is this. So if Game 1 is a tie, so that would mean Game 2 is winner take all, essentially. There'll be a lot more pricing power for the host city for Game 2. But if Game 1 is a blowout, then that Game 2 is probably much less consequential because it's going to be really hard to score that many goals and then some to really advance. So the pricing power might be gone. That's what we set out to prove. So let's first look at this. So this is when leg 1, the first game of the 2-game series, was a tie. So what we see here, Daniel, can you kind of just walk me through the different matchups and then what you're seeing from a price growth standpoint?
Yeah, sure. So, without giving too much away, these are the ties, and these are going to be actually the better outcome because this, as hoteliers, this is what we want, right? We want close games, we want close series. So you'll see that there were some really, really big jumps in pricing when this Champions League matchup was super close. So the first example, and I'll actually call out the first example as well, because here the effect is even more exaggerated because this is a game that actually had a really big gap in between those 2 games. So this
Yeah.
also kind of pulls in that time between games factor that we talked about kind of with that first Detroit Lions example. But if you look here, you've got this long gap in between games. The first game was a 1-1 tie. So then that game is going to move to Manchester. And that's where that pricing really, really jumps by almost 40%
Hmm.
because, again, there's a real chance that Leipzig could win, right? Then the next couple of games, you've got Real Madrid, Man City. Those are obviously two, tier A teams, really, really big, massive teams that are going to travel really, really well, just like the Chiefs example that we saw. So there we have this really big uptick in pricing by almost 32% for this matchup. And then Arsenal and Bayern, and then Real and Bayern all kind of have that same effect. A little bit more muted, 15.5% and 18.3%. But again, these are really, really good outcomes compared to, let's now look at some blowouts. So this is what, as hoteliers, we don't really want to see, right? So here's some examples where, Real Madrid blows out Liverpool. The next game is in Madrid. So there's a lot less of an incentive for those Liverpool fans to travel to Madrid because in order for Liverpool to even have a chance, they have to win by, I think it's 4 away goals, right? And then it goes to a shootout, which it's really, really tough to do versus Real Madrid. So there, yes, Madrid did see an uptick in pricing, 10.5%, but it's not a 30-40% jump, right? It's a lot more muted. So we kind of see that same thing down the line, right? Man City versus Bayern. Then we have a PSG, and then we have that Benfica game there, where again it's single digit growth for these games, just because there's not a huge prospect for that visiting team to really win. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And also talking about time of year with certain games really still being almost winter in a lot of these markets, March, or early March, a lot of rain in San Sebastian. So we're in a situation where really understanding what is going to be driving that demand, what time of year it is, and frankly the outcome of game one. So in summation, so past performance, as you saw, is not going to be indicative of future results. However, we really hope we gave you, the revenue managers and the operators, the tools and the things to look out for when you're examining your own markets, teams, and the outcomes of the games, and really trying to dive into those factors that might allow you to understand where I should price my hotel for this specific game. Who are we facing? Do they travel well? How far do they need to travel? How far am I from the stadium that is going to host the event? Is Taylor Swift going to be there? Because if she is, I can really drive pricing. That's what it comes down to. What round is it in the playoffs? Is it the World Series? Is this game one? Is there a lot of time between the games to allow me to build up demand, build up pricing power? Am I in a time of year where it's rainy and people aren't otherwise going to come, and I have to price accordingly to really induce that demand? Was the previous game a blowout and people are just a little bit, they're like, they're going to win anyway. Do I need to be there? So these are the things you got to think about as a hotelier, as a person who sets rate. And again, just think about the things we pointed out and how it applies to your teams, your market, and your property. Right now, really quickly, you're going to see a little thing pop on your screen. This is going to be, we're Lighthouse. We are a hotel tech platform. Tons of tools, tons of opportunities to glean insights out of data. If you want to be contacted by someone from our company, just click the little yes button and hit vote, and someone from our organization will reach out to you. All you got to do is hit yes and then click the vote button, and then you'll be fine. If you don't do anything or hit no harm, no foul. But if you want to be contacted, there's your opportunity right there. Thank you guys all so much for joining. We are live every single month, so look out for emails, notifications for future live events. We really hope you enjoyed this. We hope you got some insights, most importantly. My name is Blake Ryder.
I'm Daniel Foreman.
And thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.